Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partners with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across the globe to develop community organising strategies and train leaders to build power from within their community. And in 2021, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories, inspire others, take action, strategise, give hope and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Socially Democratic is also presented to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Are you passionate about providing access to justice? Maurice Blackburn, Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, is looking for an associate to join their employment and industrial law team on a full-time, permanent basis. You will use your legal, technical knowledge and expertise to strive for fair outcomes for our clients. The role is based in sunny Melbourne. And to apply, go to mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. Be part of change and fight for fair. Apply now. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that dives into the progressive campaigns and issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And on this week's episode, we are joined by a good friend of mine, Scott Connolly, who is the Assistant Secretary of the ACTU, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, the peak body that represents unions across this great southern land of ours. And they held their triennial Congress. It happens every 3 years, triennial, last week, albeit online. And he'll come on today's show to talk to us about that, as well as the role that the ACTU played in getting JobKeeper up last year, what the government should be doing now to support Australian workers. And we'll talk about a whole bunch of other things, including the gig economy, some success stories for the union movement in terms of membership growth, and how to tackle big multinationals like Amazon. Also, let you know that speaking of Amazon, next week's episode is with Lawrence Ben, who is the National Political Director for the DSU, which is the Retail, Wholesale and Department Store Union in the United States. If you have been following the campaign to unionise and organise Amazon in the United States, you'll know that that union, the RWDSU, have been running an election campaign or an organising campaign in one of the Amazon warehouses in Bessemer, Alabama, just outside the just outside Birmingham, Alabama. And Lawrence will be on next week's show to give us the lowdown on that entire campaign. It was unsuccessful. So not that that's a spoiler alert. I think we all know that. But in recent days, there's actually been some news coming out of the Labor Board in the United States that has recommended that there needs to be a do-over, a re-election, because of the conditions upon which the election was conducted. They've come to the conclusion that it wasn't kosher. So they should do another election. So this story hasn't ended, basically. But we thought we'd get Lawrence on to talk us about the campaign and the ins and outs and all the shit tactics that the company used against workers, intimidation to stop them from voting in support of the union. So check out that episode next week. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, let us know by leaving us a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And for all updates about recent episodes, follow us at Dunn Street, that's DUNNSTREET, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. Okay, we're taping this one on a Friday morning in lockdown Melbourne again, the sixth time. COVID, it's like Tony Liberatore, just can't seem to shake that tag. But to help us get through the next 7 days of being locked down, certainly here for us in Victoria, we are joined by the Assistant Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions and a good friend of mine, Scott Connolly. Welcome to Socially Democratic.
Fantastic to be here, Stephen, and join you and everyone here in lockdown number 6 in Melbourne this morning.
You were due to have the ACTU Congress last week, and first of all, congratulations to you and your colleagues Sally, Michelle, and Liam on your re-election to your respective positions at the ACTU. Congress was due to be held last week. It's usually a pretty big affair if anyone's ever been to one before, but obviously because of COVID, you had to shift it online. I'm very keen to get a sense of how the organisation managed that. How often did you have to say, Delegate, you're on mute. No, delegate, you're on mute. No, that button. Talk us through how you move such a big and such an important event for the trade union movement here in Australia from being a face-to-face event to then an online Congress.
Yeah, look, thanks, Stephen. Thanks for taking me back there. I thought I'd, not have to think about Congress for a few years. But look, yes, it was particularly difficult, of course, to put the Congress on. We'd already made the decision at the end of last year to convene Congress virtually. We had pretty well progressed plans in place to ensure that the Congress could convene. We'd bring together a couple of thousand delegates, as we normally would do triannually, to consider both the leadership of the movement, but also, more significantly, its key policies and priorities for the next 3 years, just last week. So best laid plans, a pretty significant agenda, great list of international speakers we'd managed to arrange to come along and join us, many of whom we'd pre-recorded and scheduled virtually. But unfortunately, the extension of the restrictions in Victoria meant that with about, I think, 48 hours notice, we had to make additional plans to just make the practical decision that the logistics of convening multiple forums across multiple platforms and devices, as well as facilitating the essential democracy of the Congress in terms of delegates being able to cast votes, consider policies, move resolutions, in a format it was already difficult, was just not possible to do with the certainty that we needed to be able to take that proposition forward to the movement. So we, with the support of the executive and the key leaders in the movement, made the decision to really just curtail the Congress and to have it deal with the procedural matters it needs to deal with to ensure the functioning of the ACTU. We made an equally significant decision that all the policy matters will be considered by the executive in September, and there's already arrangements in place for that to convene. And hopefully, and we're very much looking forward to this, an opportunity for the movement to come together collectively at a special ACTU Congress towards, well, when we practically can. And I think that's the key question, because we do want to provide an opportunity for the movement to gather, as it generally does and has historically done, really since 1943. It's the only last time we've held a special Congress, and that was obviously in wartime when it was convened to respond to the war effort. But every year, every 2 years and then 3 years since then, the Congress has convened. Really been that effective workers' parliament for the working people of Australia through their unions. So it is a big thing. We managed to get through last week with a few more grey hairs and small challenges for a number of us. But, I think all in all, it was a success. And I think in terms of substantively, it wasn't a missed opportunity. I think obviously the reaffirmation of the movement support for its leadership, particularly two fantastic women leaders for the first time ever in Sally and Michelle, to have them return to our leadership. Clearly, I think they've done an outstanding job in terms of elevating the voice of working people in very, very difficult times, and ensuring that unions are back in the centre of the national debate about what is important for our country and our economy, and what's critically important for working people in these particularly trying times. So that wasn't lost, and we made the movement's voice heard out of Congress, as we usually do, just not in the way and at the volume we would have probably liked to, but there's lots more to do. And I think the movement, like I think the overwhelming majority of Australians, has been very generous in terms of patience and understanding in terms of how difficult these times are and how we do need to consider that everything can't always be as we might hope and might imagine, but we still have the important work to do, and that's ultimately the priority at the moment, just making the difference, getting what needs to be done for working Australians.
Picking up on that point you just mentioned before about the re-election of both Sally and Michelle and the role that they have played in their very first term, and it's great to see that they've been re-endorsed by the wider union movement. Certainly during the early days of the outbreak last year, and seeing Sally leading the trade union movement and the ACTU in that national conversation about how can government, from a policy standpoint, seek solutions for us to overcome or at least manage this outbreak whilst we try and find solutions, because at that point we didn't even have vaccination. And seeing Sally in the public domain and making a very, very strong case for working people, it actually felt like, I don't, and no disrespect to previous leaders prior to that, but it was the first time I felt like the ACTU were back in that national conversation and actually throwing their weight around for the first time for a very, very long time. I don't know if you got that sense as well. How has the ACTU found how has it gone in terms of the relationships it's had both at a federal government level and at a state government level, and getting to those rooms where decisions are made to ensure that their voice is heard, but also then the policies that you guys are coming up with are being enacted?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of parts to that, Stephen, and I think the most obvious one is really the calibre of leadership we have in both Sally and Michelle, and their particular capacity to cut through at so many levels and demand our voice be heard in not just the traditional forums, but wider community forums, and the significant power that the ACTU has, not just institutional power as an important body representing working people in this country, that is, and generally has been recognised by governments despite their political persuasion, but significantly and really powerfully in terms of our capacity to cut through to the community and reflect those priorities that workers, be they union members or not, are feeling, and giving voice to those concerns. So I think, at the start of this if you look back to February, March last year, the government, to its credit, did take an approach where they were extraordinary times and did think about this differently than they would have traditionally done, albeit reluctantly. I think, to be fair, it wasn't their natural response. I think there was a lot of hiding, there was a lot of denial, there was a lot of default positioning. Let's go back to politicising this and how do we respond to this. But when it became very paramount and clear that this wasn't a normal event, that it was an extraordinary set of circumstances, that it was a global crisis, there was clearly a consensus that we needed a different response, that the Australian people, I think, again, made this very clear, and we picked this up in polling we were doing around this time last year, that the expectation of the Australian community was not more of the same. There was an expectation that we all put our shoulder to the wheel. That Team Australia tagline that became popular at the time was not something that happened because it was leadership. Overwhelmingly, it was coming through because that's what the community wanted and expected, and made it clear, both in the things we were seeing, but equally conversations we were having. And the government responded to that and put in place practical steps to ensure that the COVID recovery, the commission, the consultations around workplace reform, all were done in a way that they haven't been done historically for a very, very long time. I think probably the last time Labor held office federally, if not further back, frankly, in terms of how all the parties contributed to the response. So that was very different, in terms of someone sitting inside the ACTU and seeing those things and being at those forums. We hadn't been exposed to that. And by and large, that was reflected across all all levels of government. There was an extraordinary level of cooperation across the states, particularly us, being able to coordinate with state Labor governments. The institution of the National Cabinet provided a significant point of leverage for working people to enable working voices to be heard and priorities. And I think the story of JobKeeper and JobSeeker is very much one of that. That wasn't one that was led by the government. They came to that really kicking and screaming very reluctantly. But given their credit, they did make the decision at the end of the day. We want them to do it again, absolutely, in terms of the significance of the crisis we're in now. But that came about because we were able to leverage support across state and territory leaders and using the National Cabinet mechanisms to establish a point where the government and employers, to their credit, provided one voice and one clear solution that made such a significant difference through those 6 to 7 months in the middle of last year.
Yeah, and that's I don't know, certainly in circles of family and friends that aren't politically engaged, all perceive that JobKeeper was a policy initiative that came out of the Morrison government, and it's a story that needs to be corrected. And here's a good opportunity for you to do that. Walk us through the steps that the union movement and the ACTU took to come up with that idea, and then actually start to make that happen and push that on government to take that initiative, that policy initiative, or embrace it.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think, for us, we did a lot of work, at the start of last year, particularly looking to what the experience was both in Europe and in the UK. And I think the furlough initiative that the big unions in the UK, Unite particularly, has led and saw established again, from an outsider, it looked like the government's initiative and less contested, but it was very clear to us that a direct wage subsidy tied to the employer was going to be a point of difference that was required to ensure that we maintained continuity, responsiveness, and critically support for working people and their employers to enable themselves to recover. So we did a lot of work, both establishing the merits of the argument, drawing on international experience directly with governments and union leaders across the globe, and being able to coordinate that and present that. Then, of course, it was a mobilising of additional voices to support our initiative, and particularly our capacity to work with business in a way that we really haven't done in a very long time. Again, to respond collaboratively, the BCA in particular, some of the other bigger employers, all were significant voices that enabled us to incrementally move the government, who'd made it very clear multiple times that a direct subsidy tying workers and wages to their employer was not something they thought necessary or essential. But over the course of probably about that period between March and April, we were able to build the momentum. And critical to that, of course, was unfortunately the circumstances that we're all confronting, the continuation of lockdown, the impact of COVID across communities and the devastation it was wreaking. The real tipping point, there was two sort of critical moments that made this the success that it has been. And they were, of course, that day when I think we all remember the massive queues at Centrelink offices across the country, the movement's capacity to quickly respond to that, tell that story. I think every nightly news story led with that night. It didn't just lead with the cues and the visuals. It led with stories of working people telling their stories and their frustrations of what that meant, their concerns, their anxieties. And that was our capacity to respond and tell that story. The next day, it was a conversation with this can't continue. Critically, the BCA came out and lent its support. And I think later that week or on the weekend, we saw the announcement of JobKeeper in its first iteration. So, circumstances, the capacity to respond, really that organising story about opportunity, taking them, but also being ready and responsive when those present, and of course the collaboration with non-traditional allies around a common purpose really made those points of difference.
And it's a huge piece of public policy. And to your point earlier on, you said you dragged the government kicking and screaming to embrace this wave of Team Australia that was coming from the community and put politics to one side. And it's something that I've started to think about recently with a couple of guests who I've had on in the last couple of weeks, is that, because March, April 2020 now feels like it was a decade ago. I keep on forgetting that there was that kind of national unity there at that moment, between Liberal and Labor governments, between obviously business and the union movement and the community in general, about we need to all pull together to get over this. And there was that piece of unity. Fast forward to today, and I know that you guys are keen to try and get this JobKeeper 2.0 scheme up. I feel like as if the federal government have gone, you know what, it's just all too hard. Like, really, do we have to do all this again? I thought we just did that once last time and that would be enough. Is that your sense that you're getting from government right now?
Look, I think it's at a number of levels, it's really concerning what we're seeing now, in terms of both the tenacity and capacity of our leadership at that federal level to respond to the crisis. I really do think we're seeing a crisis in leadership where there isn't that real vision and that capacity to cut through and bring everybody together. That, as part of that, the extension of this, we're sort of seeing a default position to the old politics, blame gaming around who's responsible. It's either it's lockdown or it's vaccination, sort of tit for tat daily in the press cycle between state leaders in the Commonwealth, and no real cut through around what is the pathway out, and the prospect that the only response from our national leadership is that we've got to wait 4 or 5 months before we have any prospect of things returning to normality, is just a reflection, I think, of your point, a real challenge that they aren't able to meet, and it's wearing absolutely thin across leadership institutions, the movement, but more significantly small business people across the country, working people significantly across the country, are just sort of I think really, really struggling, and that is indicative of if you look through our experience with this government, unfortunately, at every moment they're challenged. They've let us down. This is one again. There was an exception, of course, in the middle of early last year, where we were all able to come together and cut through. But we're not seeing that again, and that's a significant concern that there isn't another way. And I don't think that's the case at all, because there is multitudes of voices providing alternatives about how we can actually get this done, how we can coordinate, how we can assist. As one practical example, I know we might get to this later on about employer responses, but the most obvious way we can assist with rollout and facilitating the vaccine uptake when it becomes available, of course, is using workplaces and using employers. And that's been a key suggestion of ours, I think, from probably this time last year, about how that's leveraged. And it's only now getting on the table, albeit still reluctantly. At a meeting less than, I think, a few weeks ago now, again, it's on the back burner, not a priority. And we're, of course, now seeing some fracturing happening in that community, where people are running out and doing their own thing because they're not prepared to wait anymore. And that's a significant concern about what that means in terms of responses, what that means in terms of speed of recovery, what that means in terms of the equity of what happens on the other side of this, and how many people get out, how many people don't get out, and who we're leaving behind. And that's all things, I think, that's not consistent with the Team Australia approach. I don't think it's consistent with our community's expectation, and nor is it consistent, I think, with our capacity to do what is best for our country through this crisis.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, I'm keen to get an idea from you guys about where do you see, what do you want from government in response to, I guess, the two critical things that we're dealing with right now. Whilst we haven't reached that 80% vaccination levels, and that's going to take some time, and even then I don't even know when the hell that's going to take because of the issue with supply, we're going to continue to have these rolling lockdowns, which is going to impact on people who are working in part-time, casual, or industries that are impacted by this. What does the ACTU want to see from government to respond to these two critical issues that we're facing in the community?
Yeah, look, it's very simple. We need wage support, for working people. Like, absolutely, we should have a return to set of subsidies, not in dollar terms as we have now, and that's a good step. Yeah, absolutely, it's great to see the 750 back there as it was, through JobKeeper last year. But we need it tied to the employer. It should be the scheme that it was, and I think there's an increasing a number of voices saying that needs to be the case, and the government's nothing more than ideological objection to that, and recognition of their own failures with the way they did govern the scheme. I think there's a political sensitivity to it as well that's driving some of their reluctance. But that's critical, and working people need to know that they have support when they need it, but also they don't have any incentive or any necessity to incur and break the community requirements and restrictions that are in place, taking away that economic imperative of people to have to go to work, to put food on the table, to pay their bills. And that's very much continuing to drive some of the outbreaks we're seeing. And then sort of further to that practical support is the imperative for paid pandemic leave. Like, there's just a no-brainer here that we need mechanisms for people to be able to access vaccination leave through their workplaces. Should be supported by the Commonwealth. Where it has been supported by state governments, it has made a significant difference. We've seen that in Victoria, we've seen it in Queensland, and the capacity for outbreaks to be managed, the communities to respond, has made a significant difference, contrast to what we're seeing in particular parts of Sydney at the moment.
Moving on to other sort of matters that I'm sure you're probably sick of talking about COVID. I think we're all kind of, although having said that, I said this to a friend of mine the other day who's a researcher. I said, I think we're all sick of talking about COVID. And he said, well, actually, no. Everyone wants to talk about COVID. That's what everyone is talking about right now. And I was in a bar yesterday afternoon, and before our Premier told us that we'll have to go home, and I could hear the couple behind me, and they were talking about vaccines. Are we going to get Pfizer? Are you going to get, AZ? It's dominating.
Yeah, look, I think just to that point, I think it is. Yes, obviously it's draining and all that, but equally, I think it's useful to sort of just reflect on just how significant this is and how significant these times are that we're living in. And your point about Team Australia and the government's response, like that, it's unheard of. What's happened, what we've been able to achieve in so many ways. And I think, one thing the movement doesn't do well is certainly celebrate its significance and its successes as well as it should. But I think, we should all certainly take a moment to pause and just reflect on how much we've achieved, how big a difference we've made, and also be able to learn from this next time this happens. And I think, there's that inking feeling in the back of my mind that this is unlikely to be the last challenge that we're going to be confronted with, and take enormous strength from our capacity to respond and come together so successfully as we have done.
I mean, and that's you're right, Scott. That makes me think about that. I don't understand why in the example that we have had in the early part of this outbreak that we saw when community, business, government and unions or working people come together and use their resources and their interests that can be united around a common goal or a shared purpose to overcome this problem that we face, that we don't then continue to do that, because obviously we're seeing new iterations of the same problem, right? This Delta variant is a new iteration of that problem. If I was Morrison or any leader, that's what I'd be getting everyone back on the phone again. All right, everyone come back in again. How are we going to fix this one? But it's like as if they've got exhaustion. Like they're going, do they think that was a one-trick pony, or is it like I don't want to do that again, or is he looking at it politically, saying, I look like I'm weak? I can't get.
Look, I think it's the latter. I think unfortunately it's a bit of the latter. It's a bit of capacity, and it's also a bit of an eye to the future. And sort of thinking through, well, what's on the other side of this? Who are my stakeholders? Who's surviving this? Who's going to come out on the other side? And are they me, or are they with me, or are they not? And I think on the current trajectory, there's to be an enormous sense of comfort if you're sitting in that chair saying, well, at the end of this, it's going to be my Australia that comes through this. And I think that's an appalling, narrow very insular view of what this country is, and the role and responsibility of the Prime Minister, and how partisan this government is, how partisan its response has been in so many ways. And I think, all of us that aren't part of that very, very small cohort need to be challenged fundamentally by that prospect, and doing everything we can do to ensure that that's not the future of this country. But I think, I'm one that will spend the next 12 to 18 months determined to make sure that that isn't the case, and the entire movement will be committed to ensuring that's not the case. I think that's very much this contest. And if you look through to next May, when the next federal election falls due, the prospect that things are turned around by then is probably the long strategy that I think the government's taking at the moment, a very narrow, very politically focused strategy that puts all of our country's entire future at risk, and more significantly, so many families, so many communities, so many small businesses to the wall, just because they're not of that colour blue that this government particularly like.
You don't live in Western Sydney or some part of regional Queensland.
Yeah.
To that point then, I was going to ask you this question a bit later on, but it's probably a useful time to bring it up. I had your colleague on, Liam O'Brien, on the show, it was way back in 2019, and it wasn't long after the federal election, and I asked him a question about the Change the Rules campaign, and has the movement had an opportunity to sort of evaluate the pluses and deltas and takeaways from that campaign? And I think at the time he probably said, look, we're looking into it. It's probably a little bit too soon right now. We need to get a lot of that data back. But it's been 3 years almost now since then. What are your reflections on that campaign, the role that the ACTU can play in, I guess, what we would call electoral organising workers in the lead up to a federal or a state election? And what are your thoughts going into this next election cycle at a federal level? How we strategically approach this one? Is it more of the same? Or is it something?
Look, I think I think we've got a clearer vision of a clearer line of what we could have done better with Change the Rules, and I think we much like our colleagues to some degree had a very big agenda, significantly mobilised around that, what was needed to change our workplace relations in this country for working people, and flip a decade or so back to where it needed to be in terms of bringing back some balance, both to the wage share of the economy, productivity, workers' rights, so many aspects of our experience of Australians. So it was a big battle and a big agenda, and I think that's sort of one point that hasn't been lost on us about its size was an issue. No question about that. And that won't be the approach we're sort of taking forward in terms of the next election, in terms of that and ambition. I think another sort of point is sort of how broad we were in terms of our ambition and our reach, and I think again some learnings around that, sort of just refocusing us on what's required to win, and equally playing to our strengths, and sort of to pick up from those points of there's obviously a narrowness to this in terms of the electoral map that will be taking forward into how we allocate movement's resources into next year, but then equally how we play to our strengths, and for that it's really a focus on workplaces, a focus on working people in their workplaces that was sort of looking to prioritise, and perhaps to some degree go back to our more traditional approach to the movement's role in electoral politics, really mobilising where we're strong, mobilising workers as opposed to a bigger, community and political pitch. So there's sort of the elements I think that we've learned from and sort of reflected upon, and equally the things we're sort of picking up as we start thinking about what our role is going forward. And it's one very much focused on what are the priorities for workers in a very narrow sense, and sort of the prelude to that, but there's no rocket science to this. I think, what is critical for working people, it's about the issues of precarity, it's the issues of casualisation, it's the need for people to have security, job security, economic security, for working people and their key priorities that will be taken forward, from workplaces into the political debate over the course of the next 8 months or so.
I want to talk more about casualisation in a moment, but just if I can sort of ask a more broader question about a couple of things in relation to I guess the pillar of Australian industrial relations has always been the independent umpire, and that the Fair Work Commission changes its name as often as I can't think of other things that change their name a lot, but. I had the National Assistant Secretary of the SDA on a couple of weeks ago, Julia Fox, and we were talking about the Fair Work Commission. We were talking about the decisions that they've handed down recently in terms of the annual wage review, and also the ones that they did last year as well. And everyone looks at supermarket workers as that cohort of essential workers during this crisis, right? Because they're the people who help us put food on the table. And we were lamenting the decisions by the Fair Work Commission in terms of delaying the wage increases to those particular workers. And another group of other workers, I think hospitality workers as well, might have come into that cohort. I was questioning the role of the Fair Work Commission. And I don't want to undermine, I think that it's a unique and important character of our industrial relations system is the independent umpire. I think the United States would kill for something like this. But I'm now starting to wonder, how independent is that umpire? I just want to get your thoughts on the role of the commission and how it can be improved.
Oh, look, it's a captured beast, very much so at the moment. After 10 years of coalition government, every appointment under this government to the commission has got progressively worse, frankly. And I think really that's what we're seeing in terms of both the colour of the judgment, the level of independence from the tribunal, and lots of things happen, of course, behind the scenes in terms of the battles that go on within the tribunal that sort of make you very much thankful that it's coming up to some degree with the decisions it is, because if there weren't people within there fighting, it would be an awful lot worse, given some of the agendas that some of the protagonists have that are sitting on those benches and blatantly pursuing them. That, of course, is completely contrary to its role. But one very much constructed by this government, by the appointments that have been made over the course of their period in government now. And we're seeing that play out. I think, the tribunal's decisions in relation to the minimum wage have been very, very disappointing last year, absolutely. But in preceding years, did make a significant difference. It's sort of back on track to some degree this year, but, it really... picking up this point that Julia made, of course, are still taking a narrow view to the economy and listening far too much to some of the economic analysis, as opposed to its more traditional role about reflecting balance in terms of outcomes across the community. So, I think going forward, it's a key thing in terms of its appointments. It's a key thing in terms of its independence, and absolutely part of our agenda for a Labor government, not one that we sort of put on the top of the list, but rebalancing the tribunal, reinvesting in its importance, and also going back to its more traditional role, not just being a responsive body that meets the needs of the protagonists in the workplace relations system, but one also that looks to its responsibilities going forward in terms of creating new laws. And we've lost that as well. Like, I think we could probably temper our frustration and anger with some of the decisions the tribunal was making if it was getting on with the job of advancing the rights of working people in this country, dealing with the issues that we're facing. The labour market is not the traditional labour market it was, but our industrial laws and our industrial systems are just not keeping up with the system. We are not. It's taken us, over 6 or 7 years to win domestic violence leave for working people using the mechanism of the tribunal. That's appalling. The evidence is overwhelming that is a right for working people that they should have. It makes such a difference to the lives of workers. and to have that drag through the system for years and years and years, it's just appalling. The fact that workers in our new parts of our economy don't have rights and can't have access to the tribunal, again, is appalling. And then to have judges give you traditional judgments that they don't fit this prism of a worker, is just outrageous and just a slap in the face to a massive amount of workers in our economy. And we're seeing, this, you've made the point about the US, how much they like our system. Well, one thing we definitely don't want is their system and their treatment of working people, and the fact that there is classes of workers in that country, an overwhelming majority of those that don't have rights. And we're unfortunately seeing that play out in how our tribunals treating far too many workers in our economy at the moment.
Good time to talk about the gig economy. So obviously you sort of alluded to it in your remarks there. You and I are both former organisers of the Transport Workers Unions, is firmly in their backyard. It's an industry that I assume is just growing rapidly. Must be super tough to organise, but I would assume that the conditions that these workers are operating under are pretty poor, and where there is tension and there is issues and problems that it's good things to organise around. What are the challenges that the movement's having in dealing with the gig economy? But where are some of this? I know there have been recently some small wins, which is great because that's what we can build on. Talk us through some of those as well.
Yeah, look, I think we're seeing just to point how much growth there is here is just it's really exponential is probably the word to describe it. And I think people's own experience of lockdowns is just accelerating these changes, and employers are quickly adapting at so many levels to the need to provide delivery services, and doing so in utilising non-traditional ways of work, in terms of technology-enabled platforms of Uber and Uber Eats, and a whole raft of them. Didi, I think, is now in our marketplace as well. So just a massive growth of the sector, and that's not going to stop. I think it's going to get more entrenched, and clearly it's becoming more entrenched, not just in transport but in other forms of work as well. I think there's a growing tendency for more traditional forms of work. Organised workplaces, offices are also looking to shift and use these sort of structures of piecework, platform-based work to organise themselves going forward. So all of that's concerning. But in terms of our capacity to organise them, I think the positives of this is just technology is a negative, of course, in terms of it's easier for people to be denied rights, but then in so many other ways for organisers, it's easier for us to bring people together. It's easier for us to form communities and ecosystems. And it's easy for us in some degree to respond and provide points of leverage. And, I think using social media, using, the mechanisms out there that we have, really successfully been able to do, is providing the movement with capacity to really quickly respond in non-traditional ways and bring leverage to some of these more traditional employers and their blatant or flagrant disregard of the law. Just a case from this week has been the decision in relation to McCain, where a social media campaign played a key role in bringing those workers some justice to an issue they were dealing with in their workplaces. The campaign we've been running about Harvey Norman and its outrageous abuse of JobKeeper laws, again bringing massive pressure to that employer on behalf of those working people. And then equally in terms of what unions are doing at a more granular level in terms of organising workers in the gig economy, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne to a lesser degree. The way that the Transport Workers Union and the Rideshare Association has been able to build a community of drivers being prepared to stand up and organise. And there's a class action being launched, I think, just this week on behalf of rideshare workers, as supported by the union, to seek underpayments and effectively misclassification. The initiative that the TWU spearhead in relation to menu log piloting an employment and a more traditional employment model for its drivers in the Sydney marketplace is a massive victory. And globally, of course, we've had a judgment in the UK courts which have said that these platforms cannot be the mechanism to take away workers' rights, and effectively deeming drivers in the UK system as notional employees under their employment contract system. And the Californian state, which again has initiated legislation which will see rideshare drivers are deemed employees for the state of California. So I think there's a similar initiative on the books in New York. So it's trending back our way, and I think that's just a credit to the tenacity of the movement and the strength of working people in these communities to come together and organise and make their case for justice and dignity in their workplaces.
I want to ask you a question about union membership and growth, and I know that the narrative that's always been put out by the mainstream media is that it's in decline, or at best it's in a holding pattern. But where are there examples of growth that you've seen for union membership?
Yeah, look, I think really, this is never going to be as good as we'd like it to be in terms of the story of union density and union growth. But encouragingly, from our perspective, it is on an upward trend at the moment, and that's really encouraging in terms of both our proportion of working people that are union members in this country. So that's sort of the highest it's been in a long time, sitting at the ACTU in terms of our affiliation numbers. Particularly, we're seeing that in unsurprisingly the healthcare sector and the growth of what's happening in the personal care services sector. So that's very encouraging. Equally, we're seeing a higher proportion of women members than we have ever before. I think the current stats are it's about 60+% of the movement is now women, and that's a very sort of encouraging a figure as well. And we're also seeing a number of young people come to the movement. I think for our sort of our own initiatives here at the ACTU, we're seeing a very significant uptake of young people joining the movement. We're having enormous success using TikTok, just as one example, in terms of a platform to connect with young people and bring them to the movement. And a lot of sort of people, I think, has sort of dawned on them over the course of the last 12 months, 18 months, that there's so much of this that we're all in together, to a point about how we've been able to leverage our voice on a national level and drive that down into workplaces and people's own lived experience of work over the course, using those platforms over the course of the last 12 months has been sort of a lesson for us in terms of the intersection of community messaging, political organising, responding to a crisis, but also relevance in terms of union membership for working people in workplaces. And we're sort of seeing that play out in all of those areas, as well as unions adapting and innovating. As challenging as the environments we're organising in is at the moment, unions have shown, like I think a lot of social organisations, extraordinary responsiveness and tenacity to just get on with the job of finding ways to organise people, finding ways of bringing people together. I think we've probably reached more people over the course of the last 12 months than we ever have reached. Certainly we've trained more people here at the ACTU than we've ever had before. We've had more people convene and come to meetings here than ever before, and from so many more diverse areas. So the negatives sort of it's not the way we'd like to be doing business, but in terms of our capacity to be accessible, to reach out to people and provide the movement and what it does for working people, has sort of been enabled by the crisis. And I think, unions have done an extraordinary job adapting and responding and being accessible to workers in their time of need. And, there's nothing new about that. I think we're always stronger in times of crisis, but I think we certainly are getting better at our capacity to respond and capitalise that, and more focused on what it is that working people need, but also what's important for unions in terms of their capacity to respond and meet workers in terms of their needs in workplaces, and I think those things are sort of paying dividends in what we're seeing in terms of growth. The ASU, I think, is doing great jobs. The SDA, I think, particularly as well, and I've mentioned sort of the healthcare unions just doing an extraordinary amount of work. Of course, in terms of that crisis that they're very much on the front line of.
Yeah, I mean, certainly talking to some of those unions you just mentioned there, partner with Dunn Street, their experience has been that those workers that are frontline, what I would call frontline essential workers, during this crisis have turned to their union. That's been the experience they've got. If they weren't a member of the union, they sure as hell were by the end of it, because they realised that they needed someone to actually represent them. And that's out of that sort of what this pandemic has been is a horrific experience for a lot of people around the world. There is some positives to come out of it, and that certainly is for the union movement to get stronger and better and represent people. You mentioned before about when we talked about the United States and not wanting to see their system come over here. On next week's episode of Social Democratic, I'm interviewing Lawrence Ben, who works for the Retail, Wholesale and Department Store Union in the United States, and he's going to come on and talk about their recent campaign to try and unionise Amazon in Alabama. I'm keen to get your thoughts on the experiences that we are having with Amazon and big multinational companies in the United States that are coming to Australia, because as a young union organiser, I was always, as working for the SDA, we're always worried about Walmart coming over to Australia and bringing their industrial relations norms to the Australian landscape, and that was always a great fear of ours. Even Woolworths and Coles and that said, you don't want Walmart coming here because that's going to completely change the landscape of the relationship we have between employee, employer. Now we have Amazon here, and I'm sure there are other companies like that we're worried about. What's been the experience of trying to organise in a vehemently anti-union company, but in a country where it's not, I guess the relationship between employee and employer isn't as antagonistic as it is in the United States?
Yeah, look, it's very, it's challenging, and I think, we had Lawrence as one of our guests at Congress, so I'm looking forward to that conversation. Next week, that's an extraordinary campaign, particularly that work down at Bessemer, and a great sort of story in terms of the movement's capacity to coordinate globally, and work at so many different levels in terms of applying pressure to a massive multinational. The Amazon campaign, something that's been going on for a number of years and will continue. And I think the movement's very clear and very determined in its focus on not just addressing the immediate issues in those workplaces, which are so stark and so appalling in so many ways across the Amazon business, but also its market power in just a critical part of the economy. You mentioned Coles and Woolworths, and that retail consumption market is such a big part of the economy. I know it's sort of just one small example. It's responsible for about 80% of the truck movements in this country, retail truck movements across our national highways, all driven by our two major retailers. So just think about that extrapolated across so many other parts of the consumption market. It's massive, and to have one provider, Amazon in this case globally, dominating to such an extent is a very significant concern, and one that the movement globally has determined. I know that the ITUC globally has made Amazon a key campaign, and we're determined to sort of break up Amazon. I think ultimately is the agenda, and I think there's been some positive noises again responding to the movement's voice from the Biden administration, looking at that sort of aspect over the course of this initial term. But back to sort of practical organising, sort of how we're doing it. It's really hard in terms of Amazon. Initially, the experience here was, as it sort of often is, sort of a gentle. They are considered and strategic, I think, in their approach initially to their entry into the Australian market, and came making all the right noises. Didn't really upset things. Started small. But as they've grown over the course of the last 2 years, and it's probably just a little bit over 2 years now, they've had warehouses both in Sydney, an operation in Brisbane, and they're expanding in Melbourne. We've seen an increase in, a reversion to the more traditional role that we know of Amazon, and the UWU is just one example in terms of their organising, probably the first union that saw some of those starker elements in the warehousing operations down in Victoria. And really it was just a playbook that we'd seen played out in some of the Midwestern states in the US of sweated labour, pooling rights, Amazon time being applied. Which is, of course, effectively running between tasks and running between jobs and being timed and denied the most fundamental of rights, including toilet breaks in people's experience of work in some of those sheds, and the denial of people's access to their unions, and making it very hard for unions to access workplaces. But, we have sort of, again, picking up those points about adapting, been able to still pick up those workplaces. The SDA's been very successful in terms of representing workers to date in difficult circumstances in Sydney, at the warehouse operations in Sydney. They've organised a couple of pickets already so far. There was a day of action at Amazon just a few weeks ago where all the unions participated. It was globally coordinated in response to this. So I think, while it's tough, while the employers, do inevitably, we think, adapt their sort of global approach to management and very much run it out of their global operations, we're able to sort of work through in traditional ways and force them to come to the table. And the key thing for us, I think, is sort of picking up. We can't do that on our own with these big global multinationals. The key thing is us coordinating our efforts with those global efforts, ensuring that workers recognise that they're part of a bigger battle and a bigger struggle and a bigger fight, that we're not alone in this, that it is a global effort taking on these big global monsters, and then using that strength and diversity of our organising capacity to apply that pressure to Amazon to force outcomes, be it at Bessemer, be it at West Eastern Creek in Sydney, or Dandenong in Victoria. That's our capacity to respond and organise globally against these multinationals, and equally do it at all different levels. I know that there was elements of coordinating shareholder resolutions at Amazon globally that we've asked our super funds to assist with as well, and all these things play a part in terms of forcing change at Amazon. And there has been some positive steps, but still clearly, given the results of Bessemer, so many more steps to go before we can achieve our objectives with that monster.
A long way to go. Although I did read in the papers in the last 2 days that the Labor Board in the United States has recommended that they do a redo of the ballot to unionise. So I think that story's got some more some twists and turns in it. Scott Connolly, thank you very much for your time today coming on the show. Before you wrap up, I know that if there's anyone listening to the podcast that isn't a member of a union, and I know that they're probably saying to themselves, I don't think there is a union for my workplace, and there is a union for a workplace. There is a union for every workplace. And if they want to find out what union they should join, is there a hotline that they can call at the ACTU to speak to someone?
Yeah, look, it's best to go to our website, which is actu.org.au, and our team there will help you. But the webpage is very efficient in terms of dealing with people's requests. There's a join page on there now, so it's a one-click join, and we'll help you find your union pretty quickly. I think our turnaround these days is under 24 hours. So more than happy to help, and more than happy to take as many inquiries as you have.
Fantastic. I've just shown how much of a Gen X person I've said there. I said, is there a hotline? Anyway, Scott, great to see you again. Keep up the great work. Like I said, congratulations to you and the team for your re-election. Another 3 years. Go out there and do great work for working people in this country, and hopefully we can change the government in whenever the hell the election will be.
Always a pleasure, Stephen, and thanks everyone.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button, and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.